My father's finger was inches from my face, shaking with a fury I had never seen before. "Apologize to your sister," he screamed, his voice ripping through the house, "or pack your things and get out of this house right now." It was Christmas Eve. The tree lights were still glowing behind him, soft and cheerful, like they were mocking me. Wrapped presents sat neatly under the branches, untouched. Somewhere in the kitchen, the oven timer kept beeping, forgotten. My mother stood near the hallway, gripping my sister's arm, as if she might disappear if she loosened her hold. No one asked me what actually happened. No one asked me what I meant. No one asked me anything at all. They had already decided. I remember thinking how strange it was that everything could collapse so fast. One conversation. One accusation. One demand for an apology I didn't owe. I looked at my sister then. She wouldn't meet my eyes. Her mouth was tight, not triumphant, just tense, almost nervous. Something settled inside my chest. Not panic, not anger, something colder, clearer. "All right," I said. The room relaxed immediately. My father's shoulders dropped. My mother let out a breath. My sister finally unclenched her jaw. They thought I had given in. They had no idea that by morning my room would be empty, my future would already be rerouted, and the lie holding this family together would be quietly coming apart. The silence after I said those words was almost louder than the shouting had been. My father nodded once sharply, like a judge delivering a sentence that had already been appealed in his favor. My mother wouldn't look at me at all. She just kept rubbing my sister's arm in slow, soothing circles. "Go upstairs," my father said. "Think about what you've done." Not what I'd said, not what I'd meant, what I'd done. I turned and walked away before they could say anything else. As I climbed the stairs, I could feel the house watching me. The walls, the banister, the framed family photos lining the hallway. Every image told the same story. My sister in the center, smiling. My parents glowing beside her. Me somewhere at the edge, cropped just enough to prove I existed, but never enough to matter. I closed the door to my childhood bedroom and leaned back against it. My heart was beating fast, but my hands were steady. That surprised me. I'd imagined this moment 100 times in smaller ways, always ending with me crying, apologizing, begging them to see me. Instead, I felt detached, like I was watching something from the outside. Downstairs, I could hear voices again. Lower now. Relieved. The crisis was over as far as they were concerned. My father's voice carried up the stairs. "She knows when she's crossed a line." My mother murmured something I couldn't quite make out. My sister laughed softly. A small, shaky sound. Not the laugh of someone who had won, but of someone who had escaped something by the narrowest margin. I sat on the edge of my bed and stared at the walls. The same pale blue they'd chosen when I was 10, back when they still pretended to ask my opinion. My bookshelf was full of things I'd earned on my own. Old notebooks, textbooks, certificates they'd never hung up downstairs. Proof of a life I had built quietly without applause. The punishment hit me all at once, then not emotionally, but practically. They weren't just grounding me. They weren't just angry. They were suspending my schooling. My father had been very clear. Tuition frozen, support cut. No classes next term unless I apologized publicly and meant it. My education, the one thing that had always been mine, was now leverage, a leash. I thought about how fast he'd gone there. No discussion, no warning, straight to the most extreme threat they had. That should have scared me more than it did. Instead, it made something click. This wasn't about discipline. It wasn't about teaching me a lesson. And it definitely wasn't about keeping the peace. If it were, they would have asked what happened. They would have listened. They would have tried to understand. They hadn't. They had reacted like people protecting something fragile, something that couldn't survive scrutiny. I lay back on the bed and closed my eyes, replaying the last hour. The way my sister had stayed quiet while my parents spoke for her. The way she'd flinched when my father raised his voice not at her, but at me. The way she'd watched my face when he issued the ultimatum like she was waiting to see if I would break. When I hadn't, she'd looked almost disappointed, almost afraid. That detail stuck with me. If she were truly innocent, truly wronged, she would have been triumphant, vindicated. She would have demanded the apology herself. Instead, she'd let our parents do the dirty work while she stayed just close enough to the fire to feel warm, but not close enough to get burned. I heard footsteps on the stairs. My mother paused outside my door, her hand hovering near the knob. I held my breath. After a moment, she walked away. I let it out slowly. They thought this was over. I sat up and looked around my room again, this time differently. Not as a refuge, but as a temporary space. A place I had outgrown without realizing it. My suitcase was still tucked in the closet from my last trip, half empty. I pulled it out and set it on the bed. Not because I was running, because I was thinking. Downstairs, laughter drifted up again. The television turned on. Christmas music swelled. The house was settling back into its version of normal, the one where problems disappeared as long as everyone agreed on the story. I didn't belong in that story anymore. As I folded clothes into the suitcase carefully, deliberately, I felt a strange calm spread through me. I wasn't panicking. I wasn't scrambling. I was taking inventory of what I owned, of what I knew, of what they didn't. They believed my education was something they could take away. They believed silence meant surrender. They believed that forcing an apology would erase whatever discomfort had started this. What they didn't realize yet was that suspending my schooling wasn't a punishment. It was a signal. One I had been waiting for without even knowing it. By the time the house fell quiet and the lights downstairs dimmed, my bag was half packed and my mind was made up. This wasn't about proving I was right. It was about refusing to disappear quietly. And for the first time that night, as Christmas Eve slipped toward morning, I understood something with absolute clarity. If they were this desperate to make me apologize, then the truth was worth a lot more than they were letting on. I didn't sleep that night. I lay on my back, staring at the ceiling, listening to the house breathe around me. Pipes knocking softly. The hum of the refrigerator downstairs. Christmas music still playing faintly from the living room, looping the same cheerful songs like nothing had happened. From my room, I could hear my parents' voices drifting up through the vents. Low, calm, relieved. The crisis in their minds had been handled. Order restored. No one came to check on me. No one knocked to ask if I was all right. I wasn't the one they were worried about. That role had always belonged to my sister. Even as a child, I learned that there were two versions of concern in our house. There was the gentle kind reserved for her, the kind that came with reassurances and excuses and endless patience. And then there was the sharp corrective kind meant for me, the kind that arrived already certain I was in the wrong. I rolled onto my side and laughed quietly to myself, a short, humorless sound. I wasn't jealous of my sister. That was the story they liked to tell because it made everything simpler. Envy was easier to punish than truth. What I resented was the system. The unspoken agreement that one child would be protected at all costs and the other would absorb the consequences. By morning, I had replayed our family history more times than I could count, not with nostalgia but with clarity. My sister was praised for potential. I was judged on results. When she forgot assignments, she was overwhelmed. When I struggled, I wasn't trying hard enough. When she cried, the house stopped. When I went quiet, no one noticed. There were moments, of course, little flashes that should have meant something at the time. I remembered a science fair in middle school. I'd won second place. I'd stood in the gym holding my ribbon while my parents scanned the room looking for my sister. She hadn't placed that year. On the drive home, my mother said, "You know your sister would have done better if she'd cared as much as you do. It wasn't meant to hurt. That was always the defense." I sat up in bed and pressed my feet into the carpet, grounding myself in the present. This wasn't about childhood grievances. This was about last night. About how quickly they had closed ranks around her without hesitation. I replayed the incident they were punishing me for carefully from the beginning. It had happened earlier in the week in front of other people, a setting where lying outright would have been risky. I hadn't raised my voice. I hadn't accused her of anything malicious. I had corrected something she said. One detail. Calmly. Honestly. She'd paused before reacting. I could see it clearly now. The flicker of calculation behind her eyes. She'd looked around first, gauging the room, then let her face crumple. Tears followed. Soft ones. Convincing ones. My parents had stepped in immediately. I hadn't argued then. I'd assumed the truth would matter later. That was my mistake. Downstairs, the house creaked as someone moved around. I heard my mother's footsteps light and purposeful, followed by my father's deeper stride. Doors opened and closed. The smell of coffee drifted up the stairs. Christmas morning. I stood and went to the window. Frost clung to the glass, catching the early light. Outside, the neighborhood looked peaceful. Lawns dusted with white. Wreaths still hanging on doors. Everyone else waking up to warmth and tradition. I wondered how many families were built on the same quiet bargains as mine. I dressed slowly and went downstairs. The living room looked exactly as it had the night before. Presents untouched. The tree still glowing. My sister sat on the couch wrapped in a blanket, cradling a mug with both hands. She smiled when she saw me too quickly. "Morning," she said. Her voice was careful. Measured. Not victorious. My parents were at the kitchen counter. My father glanced at me and nodded once like we had reached an understanding. My mother's smile was thin but polite. No one mentioned the apology. Not yet. I poured myself coffee and leaned against the counter. The normalcy felt rehearsed, like everyone was waiting for their cue. My sister watched me over the rim of her mug. Her eyes flicked to the suitcase by the stairs. She froze for half a second before smoothing her expression. "You're packing already?" she asked lightly. I shrugged. "Getting organized." Her fingers tightened around the mug. She looked away too quickly. That was when I knew something wasn't sitting right with her. If she truly believed she was in the right, she would have been relaxed, smug even. Instead, there was tension in her shoulders, a restless energy beneath her calm. My father cleared his throat. "We'll talk later," he said, as if this were just another disagreement that would resolve itself with time and obedience. I nodded. "Sure." I took my coffee and sat in the armchair by the window. From there, I could see the whole room without being in the center of it. I had spent most of my life in that position, observing, adjusting, staying out of the way. My sister kept glancing at her phone. Each time it buzzed, her smile faltered. Once she stood abruptly and walked into the hallway to take a call, her voice low and urgent. My parents didn't notice, or didn't want to. As she paced just out of sight, something she'd said earlier in the week floated back to me uninvited. "It all has to be settled soon," she'd said almost to herself. "Once everything's finalized, we can breathe again." At the time, I'd assumed she meant something vague. Stress, deadlines, the usual. Now, standing in the quiet tension of Christmas morning, that sentence felt heavier. People don't panic over apologies. They panic over exposure. When my sister came back into the room, her face had lost its color. She avoided my eyes and sat closer to my mother, pulling the blanket tighter around herself. My mother reached for her hand instinctively. "There you go," she murmured. "It's going to be fine. Fine for whom, I wondered." I took another sip of coffee and let the warmth settle in my chest. I wasn't angry anymore. Anger would have made this harder. I felt something steadier instead. A sense that the pieces were finally lining up, not emotionally but logically. This wasn't about me hurting my sister's feelings. It was about timing, control, and something they needed me out of the way for. As my parents chatted about Christmas plans and my sister stared down at her phone like it might explode, I leaned back in my chair and made a quiet promise to myself. If they were this determined to silence me, then whatever I wasn't supposed to see was already close. And this time, I wasn't going to look away. I went back to the moment they said I needed to apologize and pulled it apart piece by piece the way you do when something doesn't add up and you can't stop worrying at it. The incident itself had been almost boring when it happened. That was the strangest part. It wasn't a fight. It wasn't a blow-up. It didn't feel like the kind of thing that should fracture a family. We'd been at a small gathering earlier in the week, the kind my parents loved because it made us look close and successful from the outside. There were people there who knew our family, people whose opinions mattered to my parents. My sister had been talking animated and confident, telling a story that painted her in a flattering light. I hadn't interrupted her. I'd waited until she finished. Then I said one sentence. Not loudly, not sarcastically, just a correction, a factual one. The kind of thing that slips out when you're used to honesty and forget for a moment where you are. There was a pause after I spoke. A brief, uncomfortable silence that didn't belong to me. It belonged to her. She looked at me like she hadn't expected resistance. Then she looked around the room. I remember that clearly now. The way her eyes flicked from face to face, checking reactions, measuring sympathy. Only after that did her expression change. Her shoulders sagged, her mouth trembled. Tears welled up fast and convincing. Someone gasped. My mother was already moving toward her arm outstretched. My father's jaw tightened, his eyes fixed on me like I'd just committed an unforgivable offense. I hadn't even had time to explain. By the end of the night, the story had been rewritten completely. I heard it retold in fragments as people left, as coats were gathered, as goodbyes were said. Each version drifted a little further from what had actually happened. She embarrassed her sister in front of everyone. She attacked her character. She couldn't just let her have her moment. By the time we got home, I was no longer someone who had corrected a detail. I was someone who had deliberately humiliated my sister. I'd assumed the truth would matter once emotions cooled. Instead, emotions became the truth. Lying in my bed the night after Christmas Eve, I saw the pattern with brutal clarity. In our family, feelings weren't responses. They were weapons. Whoever felt the most hurt controlled the narrative. Whoever cried first, won. My sister had learned that early. I sat up and rubbed my face, the exhaustion heavy but useless. Downstairs, laughter rose again as my parents watched something cheerful on television. The sound made my chest tighten, not with sadness but with a sharp sense of distance. I was already on the outside. What haunted me wasn't that my parents had believed her. It was how quickly they'd moved from belief to punishment. There had been no attempt to mediate, no cooling-off period, no discussion, just escalation. I thought about the conversation that had followed the incident. My father standing in the kitchen, arms crossed, already angry. My mother hovering beside him, eyes fixed on the floor. "You owe your sister an apology," he'd said, "for what I'd asked, for hurting her." "I didn't hurt her," I'd said quietly. "I corrected something," she said. My sister had stood behind them, eyes red silent. She hadn't contradicted me. She hadn't confirmed my version either. That silence had done more damage than any accusation. When I hadn't apologized immediately, the tone had shifted. The language changed. It stopped being about feelings and started being about consequences. "Do you have any idea what you've put at risk?" That question had confused me at the time. I'd assumed he meant family harmony, reputation, embarrassment. All vague things my parents valued deeply. Now it echoed differently. Put at risk. I stood and paced my room, replaying that conversation with new ears. The way my father had said it. Not angry, urgent. Like time mattered. The apology had never been the point. It was the mechanism. A public admission of guilt would cement their version of events and erase mine completely. Once I apologized, the record would be set. Anyone who questioned it later would be reminded that I'd already admitted fault. It was neat, efficient, final. I stopped pacing and sat on the edge of the bed again, my mind racing faster now. I remembered something else then, a conversation from a few days before the incident. My sister and I had been alone in the kitchen. She'd been unusually tense, pacing the way she did when she was waiting on news. Once this is settled, she'd said, not looking at me, "Things will finally calm down." Settled. At the time, I'd thought she meant stress. Deadlines, work, something vague and adult that didn't involve me. But she'd said it like someone watching a clock. I pressed my fingers into the mattress, grounding myself. If the apology was meant to erase me, then suspending my schooling was meant to remove me entirely. They hadn't just wanted me quiet. They'd wanted me gone. The realization made my stomach drop, not with fear, but with something sharper. Anger, yes. But also resolve. People don't destroy a future over a bruised ego. They do it to protect something much larger. I thought about how my parents had framed the threat. Not temporary, not conditional. My schooling would remain suspended until I apologized properly, publicly, convincingly. That wasn't discipline. That was leverage. I walked to my desk and opened my laptop, not to do anything yet, just to have it there. The screen glowed softly in the dim room. My reflection stared back at me, older than it had been a week ago. The house was quiet again. Somewhere down the hall, my parents' bedroom door closed. My sister's door followed soon after. I imagined her lying awake too, replaying the day, checking her phone, counting down to whatever she was waiting for. I wasn't going to confront her. Not yet. Confrontation would only give her a chance to adjust her story again. Instead, I started writing things down. Dates, conversations, exact phrases people had used. Not out of spite, but out of necessity. I had learned painfully that memory meant nothing in a family that rewrote reality to suit its needs. Facts were the only thing that stood a chance. By the time I finished, my hands were steady again. The fear I'd expected never came. In its place was a quiet certainty. They hadn't asked me to apologize because I was wrong. They had asked because if I didn't, the truth might survive. And whatever they were so desperate to protect, I was closer to it now than I'd ever been before. By the time the house went quiet again, I wasn't thinking about apologies or hurt feelings anymore. I was thinking about math, about consequences, about how badly the punishment fit the crime. Suspending my schooling wasn't a slap on the wrist. It wasn't even a grounding. It was a demolition. Classes weren't just something you paused and restarted at will. Miss a term and you lost momentum. You lost standing. You risked scholarships recommendations, future transfers. It was the kind of threat you used when you wanted someone stuck, dependent, or gone. And all of that. Over one corrected sentence, I sat at my desk and opened my planner, flipping through pages filled with deadlines and notes. Everything I'd worked toward was there in ink. Papers due, meetings scheduled, a future that assumed continuity. My father's threat wasn't emotional. It was strategic. He'd gone straight for the one thing that gave me leverage and mobility. That realization chilled me. In our family, arguments usually followed a predictable pattern: raised voices, hurt feelings, then silence. Eventually, things went back to normal without anyone ever admitting fault. This time was different. This time there was urgency, finality, and the timing was impossible to ignore. Christmas Eve, when offices were closed, when advisors were unreachable, when everyone else was distracted by family and tradition. If I wanted help, guidance, or intervention, I wouldn't get it until after the holidays. By then, damage would already be done. Isolation wasn't an accident. It was part of the plan. I closed my planner and leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling. Who benefits if I disappear from school even temporarily? Who gains if my path suddenly detours? My sister's face floated into my mind, followed by the memory of how tense she'd been lately. How often she'd checked her phone, how carefully she'd watched my reactions. She hadn't acted like someone avenging a wrong. She'd acted like someone waiting for confirmation. I stood and paced the room again, my thoughts tightening into focus. There was overlap between our lives that I'd always dismissed as coincidence. Same circles, same institutions brushing past each other, same people occasionally mentioning both our names in the same breath. I'd never seen us as competitors. That was another story my parents liked to tell. But competition didn't require rivalry. It only required scarcity. If there was something only one of us could have, then my presence mattered. I stopped pacing when another memory surfaced, a conversation from weeks ago overheard in passing. My sister had been talking to my mother in the kitchen, voices low. I hadn't meant to listen, but one sentence stuck. It just needs to be finalized before the end of the year. Finalized. At the time, it had meant nothing to me. Now it felt like a warning I'd ignored. I sat back down at my desk and opened my laptop, not to search wildly, but to think carefully about where leverage lived. Leverage always touched paper somewhere. Forms, emails, records. Nothing important happened without leaving a trail even when people thought it did. My parents liked to believe they operated on emotion alone, that everything they did was instinctive, protective, maternal, or paternal. But threats about tuition and enrollment didn't come from instinct. They came from knowledge, from understanding systems well enough to exploit them. That meant there were systems involved, and systems had records. Downstairs, I heard my father's voice again, low and serious, followed by my mother's softer reply. I couldn't make out the words, but I recognized the tone. Damage control. Planning. Not reflection. I wondered if they realized how transparent they'd become. I pulled up my school portal, not with panic, but with intention. I didn't change anything. I didn't submit anything. I just looked. Dates. Statuses. Notes I'd never paid attention to before. Most of it was familiar, boring even, but there were sections I'd never clicked. I hesitated before opening one, my finger hovering over the trackpad. Once I started looking, there would be no going back to pretending this was just a family misunderstanding. I already knew that. Still, I took a breath. I wasn't looking for revenge. I was looking for explanation. The page loaded slowly as if it were deciding whether to cooperate. When it finally appeared, nothing jumped out immediately. That almost disappointed me. I scanned it again more carefully this time, forcing myself not to rush. Then I saw it. A notation. Small. Easy to miss if you weren't looking for it. A reference to a review process I hadn't initiated. A comment time-stamped weeks earlier. My name was on it. I stared at the screen, my pulse steady but loud in my ears. I hadn't requested any review. I hadn't signed anything. Yet there it was, recorded as if it were routine. One anomaly could be a clerical error. Two could be coincidence. But this felt deliberate. I clicked deeper, following the trail, each page opening another layer. The more I read, the clearer it became that decisions about my education had been discussed without me. Not hypothetically, actively. Someone had anticipated my absence. The air in my room felt thinner. I stood and opened the window, letting the cold in, grounding myself in something physical. Outside, the neighborhood was quiet, the world still wrapped in holiday calm. Inside, my understanding of my family was rearranging itself. My parents hadn't reacted to my behavior. They'd prepared for it. And my sister hadn't been afraid of my words. She'd been afraid of my timing. I closed the laptop carefully and sat back down, my mind racing ahead now. If there were records here, there were records elsewhere. Emails, correspondence, approvals. And if those existed, they could be found. I wasn't angry anymore. Anger would have made me reckless. What I felt instead was a sharp, almost clinical resolve. This wasn't about confronting anyone yet. It was about understanding the full scope before they realized I was looking. I backed up what I'd seen, saving copies where I could, noting access times. I was careful, methodical, the kind of careful they'd never expected from me. As I worked, a strange calm settled over me. The threat they'd used to scare me had done the opposite. It had stripped away the last illusion I'd been clinging to. This wasn't a misunderstanding that could be cleared up with a conversation. This was a plan, and plans could be disrupted. I closed my laptop and sat quietly for a long moment listening to the house. Somewhere my parents were still talking. Somewhere my sister was still watching her phone, counting down to something she thought was inevitable. They had built everything on one assumption: that I wouldn't look. That assumption was already costing them more than they knew. I woke before anyone else, the house still wrapped in the artificial calm that comes after a storm no one wants to acknowledge. The lights on the Christmas tree were still glowing in the living room, casting soft shadows on the walls, as if last night had never happened. I stood at the top of the stairs and listened. My parents' bedroom door was closed. My sister's too. Everyone was sleeping confident the problem had been contained. That confidence made my decision easier. I knew better than to confront anyone now. Confrontation in my family didn't lead to answers. It led to louder voices, rewritten stories, and tighter control. If I wanted the truth, I had to step outside the family narrative entirely. I went back into my room and closed the door quietly. I sat on the edge of my bed with my phone in my hand, staring at the contact I'd saved months ago and never thought I'd use. At the time, it had felt unnecessary. Almost dramatic. Now it felt inevitable. She wasn't close family. That was the point. She was someone who had seen how our system worked from a distance and survived it by stepping away. Someone my parents rarely mentioned anymore, except with a vague tone of disappointment. I hesitated only a moment before pressing call. She answered on the second ring, her voice calm but alert. "Hello? It's me," I said quietly. "I know it's Christmas morning. I'm sorry." There was a pause, then a soft exhale. "I wondered when you'd call," she said. That sentence landed harder than any accusation could have. We spoke in low voices, me perched on the bed, her somewhere far away, already outside the orbit of my parents' influence. I told her everything. The incident, the ultimatum, the threat to suspend my schooling. The way it had all escalated so quickly it felt rehearsed. She didn't interrupt. She didn't rush to comfort me or tell me I must be mistaken. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "That explains a lot," she finally said. My grip tightened around the phone. "What do you mean, I mean?" she said carefully. "This isn't the first time they've done something like this. You're just the first one who noticed before it was over." My stomach dropped, not with fear, but with confirmation. She explained slowly, choosing her words the way people do when they don't want to frighten you but refuse to lie. Years ago, someone else had been pushed aside quietly. Not expelled from the family, just redirected. Opportunities reassigned, stories adjusted. Everyone told it was for the best. At the time, I had been too young to see it for what it was. "What you're describing," she continued, "doesn't sound emotional. It sounds procedural." That word echoed in my mind. Procedural. She asked me questions next. Not the kind my parents asked. Not leading, not accusatory. Precise. Dates. Phrases. Who said what and when. Whether anything had been put in writing. When I mentioned the notation I'd found in my school records, she went very still. "Did you save it?" she asked. "Yes." "Good," she said. "Because that means someone started a process without your consent." The air in my room felt suddenly heavier. "Is that normal?" "No," she said flatly. "And it's not accidental." She warned me not to confront my parents yet, not to ask questions that would tip them off. "People who do this count on silence," she said. "Once they know you're looking, they'll move faster." I stared at the wall as she spoke every instinct I had, screaming that she was right. The urgency, the timing, the Christmas Eve ultimatum. It all fit together too cleanly to be coincidence. Before we hung up, she gave me something tangible. A name, an office, a place where records were kept that most people never thought to check. "If you're going to look," she said, "look properly." When the call ended, I sat there for a long time, phone resting in my lap. The house was still quiet, still peaceful, still pretending. But I wasn't alone anymore. Later that morning, I stepped outside under the pretense of taking a walk. The cold air bit into my lungs, sharp and grounding. I walked slowly, phone in my pocket, replaying the conversation in my head. I wasn't imagining things. I wasn't overreacting. Someone outside the family had seen this pattern before and named it for what it was. That changed everything. When I came back, my parents were in the kitchen acting as if nothing had shifted. My sister sat at the table scrolling through her phone with forced concentration. She looked up when I entered, her eyes searching my face for something she couldn't quite name. I smiled at her, small and polite. She didn't smile back. As the day wore on, I noticed things I might have missed before. The way my parents spoke in careful half-sentences when my sister was nearby. The way she checked her phone repeatedly, stepping away to take calls she didn't want anyone else to hear. Once I passed her in the hallway and heard her whisper, "I know, but it should have been done by now." She froze when she saw me. "Everything okay?" I asked. She nodded too quickly. "Just work stuff." I let it go. Or rather, I let her think I did. That afternoon, I locked myself in my room again and followed the trail I'd been given. Carefully. Quietly. I didn't rush. I didn't click randomly. I treated every record like a piece of fragile evidence. What I found confirmed what I'd already begun to suspect. References to decisions that assumed my absence. Notes written in neutral language that masked very real consequences. And woven through it all the same names appearing again and again. Not mistakes, not coincidences. Intent. I backed everything up just like she'd told me to. Multiple copies, multiple locations. Each file saved felt like reclaiming something that had been taken from me without permission. By evening, my hands were steady again. The fear I'd expected never came. In its place was something quieter and far more dangerous. Clarity. Downstairs, my family gathered for dinner, laughter, forced but loud enough to convince themselves. My sister sat stiffly at the table, barely touching her food. Every so often she glanced at me, her expression flickering between suspicion and unease. She knew something was wrong. She just didn't know how wrong. As I listened to my parents talk about plans and traditions, I realized something that surprised me. They hadn't destroyed my future. They'd exposed themselves. The threat to suspend my schooling wasn't power, it was desperation. And the truth, once you knew where to look, was far more powerful than anything they could take away. By the time everyone else in the house went to bed, I had crossed a line I couldn't uncross. I wasn't just suspicious anymore. I was looking for proof. I closed my bedroom door and sat at my desk, the glow of my laptop the only light in the room. Outside, Christmas lights still blinked along the street, cheerful and oblivious. Inside, my focus narrowed to one thing: records. Not rumors, not feelings. Paper, data. Trails people forget they leave behind. I followed the path I'd been given earlier that day, step by careful step. No rushing, no clicking blindly. I reminded myself that mistakes were how people like my parents kept control. They counted on panic. I wasn't going to give them that. The first portal opened with information I already knew. Enrollment status, course history. Nothing alarming. I almost relaxed. Then I saw it. A notation buried in a subsection I'd never visited before. Small, neutral, written in language so bland it was easy to overlook. A review request tied to my name initiated weeks ago. Not by me. My pulse didn't spike. It slowed. I clicked deeper, scrolling back through timestamps, cross-referencing dates. The further I went, the more my absence was assumed rather than debated. Phrases like contingent upon withdrawal and pending availability appeared again and again, as if my future were already being rearranged behind the scenes. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the ceiling for a long moment, forcing myself to breathe. This wasn't a mistake. Someone had planned for me not to be there. I went back to the screen and kept reading my movements, steady, deliberate. A single anomaly could be explained away, but there were several. Too many to dismiss. Decisions referencing my name without my consent. Notes suggesting that my departure would resolve overlap. Overlap with what exactly? The answer began to form as I traced the connections. My sister's name appeared in adjacent records. Not always directly, but close enough to be unmistakable. Same programs, same opportunities, same funding streams brushing past both of us. Places where there was room for one, not two. I had never seen it as a competition. I'd trusted that there was space for both of us. That belief felt painfully naive now. The most unsettling part wasn't the content. It was the tone. Everything was written as if my removal were a foregone conclusion. No contingency plans if I stayed. No discussion of alternatives. Just quiet preparation. I understood then why my parents had panicked when I didn't immediately apologize. An apology wouldn't have fixed hurt feelings. It would have finalized a narrative. It would have justified what they'd already set in motion. I minimized the window and opened another file. This one contained correspondence. Emails brief and professional exchanged between people who never expected me to read them. I recognized my father's writing style instantly. Polite, controlled, full of concern for family stability. My mother's messages were shorter, softer, but they carried the same implication. That my situation was temporary, that I would understand, that this was for the best. For whose best, they never specified. My chest tightened, not with heartbreak, but with something sharper. Betrayal implied surprise. This felt like recognition. I saved everything. Slowly, carefully. Each file copied to multiple locations. Each timestamp noted. I watched the access log update as I moved through the system, aware that someone could eventually notice. Let them, I thought. I'm done pretending. When I closed the laptop, the room felt too quiet. I stood and paced the carpet worn thin beneath my feet. I replayed conversations from the past year with new clarity. Comments my parents had made about timing, about decisions needing to be made soon, my sister's anxiety, her fixation on deadlines. They hadn't been reacting to me, they'd been managing a schedule. I sat back down and opened my notebook, writing as I went. Dates, names, connections. I drew lines between events that had once felt unrelated. Each line made the picture clearer. My parents hadn't chosen my sister over me because they loved her more. They'd chosen her because they'd already invested too much to stop. A soft knock on my door made me jump. I closed the notebook quickly and stood. Yes, I called. It was my mother. She opened the door just enough to peer in, her expression cautious. "We're going to bed," she said. "We'll talk tomorrow." Talk. As if this were still a misunderstanding that could be smoothed over with the right tone. "Okay," I said. She hesitated, scanning the room. My desk, my suitcase, my face. I smiled, neutral and tired. "Good night," she said finally. When the door closed, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Tomorrow, I thought. Tomorrow they'd expect remorse, gratitude for their restraint, compliance. I picked up my phone and checked the time. Late, but not too late. I sent a single message to the contact who had warned me earlier. Short, factual, no emotion. I found it. The reply came a few minutes later. I was afraid of that. Save everything. Do not confront them yet. I turned off my phone and sat in the dark for a while, letting the weight of everything settle. I thought I would feel grief, or rage, or panic. Instead, I felt steady. They had assumed my silence meant ignorance, that I would never look closely enough to see what was being done in my name. that I would fold under pressure and apologize just to keep my life intact. They were wrong. I lay down on my bed without undressing, staring up at the faint glow of lights outside my window. Somewhere down the hall, my sister shifted in her sleep. Somewhere else, my parents slept, believing they still controlled the outcome. They didn't know it yet, but the ground under them had already shifted. They had built their plan on one fatal assumption: that I would never check the records they thought I didn't understand. And now that I had, I wasn't just a problem they could silence. I was a risk they couldn't ignore. I went back to the moment I said, "All right," and finally understood why it had felt so powerful. At the time, it hadn't sounded like strength. It had sounded like surrender. One small word offered to end a storm. But the instant it left my mouth, the atmosphere in the room changed. My father relaxed. My mother softened. My sister exhaled like someone who had been holding her breath underwater. They heard compliance. What I had actually given them was misdirection. I had learned long ago that arguing in my family only made things worse. Anger gave them energy. Tears gave them control. Silence, though silence, made them careless. When they believed they had won, they stopped watching closely. That night after the ultimatum, I went upstairs exactly the way they expected me to. Head down, shoulders slumped, no slammed doors, no dramatic exit, just quiet obedience. The house settled quickly after that. My parents returned to the living room, the tension dissolving into relief. My sister laughed softly at something on television, her voice finally steady. The crisis, as far as they were concerned, had passed. I closed my bedroom door and stood still for a long moment, listening to them move on without me. Then I started packing. Not frantically, not emotionally. I didn't throw things into bags or tear posters off the walls. I packed the way someone does when they know exactly what they're doing. Only what belonged to me. Clothes I'd bought myself, books I'd paid for, papers that mattered. Each item I folded felt like a quiet declaration. This isn't yours to take from me. As I worked, I thought about how often my restraint had been mistaken for weakness. Teachers, friends, even my parents. People who spoke the loudest were assumed to be the strongest. People who waited were overlooked. Being underestimated had cost me years, but it had also taught me how to observe. Weeks before Christmas, long before the blow-up, I had started exploring alternatives. Not because I was planning to leave, but because curiosity had nudged me there. Transfer policies, academic bridges, programs I'd assumed were out of reach. I hadn't told anyone. It felt premature, almost disloyal. Now it felt like instinct. Those late-night searches, those saved links and half-written drafts hadn't been acts of rebellion. They had been quiet insurance policies, a backup life I hadn't known I'd need. I moved methodically, checking items off an internal list: passport, documents, notes, evidence. Everything important was either packed or backed up. Downstairs, I could hear my parents laughing again. The sound no longer hurt. It felt distant, like noise from another house. They assumed my silence meant shame, that I was upstairs spiraling, rehearsing an apology. My sister probably believed it too. She had always mistaken stillness for defeat. I paused at my desk and looked at my laptop. Everything I had uncovered over the last 2 days was there. Copies saved in multiple places. Records that told a story no one downstairs wanted told. I didn't open it. Not yet. This wasn't the moment for exposure. It was the moment for positioning. I sat on the edge of my bed and let myself feel what I'd been postponing. The grief came first. Not sharp, but heavy. Grief for the version of my parents I'd wanted to believe in. For the idea that fairness would eventually show up if I just stayed calm and reasonable. That idea was gone now. In its place was something steadier. Clarity. I wasn't going to win anything by proving I was right. I was going to win by making myself unreachable. I lay back and stared at the ceiling, listening to the house wind down for the night. Doors closing, lights switching off, footsteps fading. One by one, the people who thought they controlled my future went to sleep. I stayed awake, not out of anxiety, but out of purpose. Strategic silence wasn't passive, it was active restraint. Every instinct in me wanted to confront them, to demand explanations, to ask why they had planned my removal without my consent. But confrontation would only accelerate their timeline. It would make them defensive. It would alert them that I knew too much. So I stayed quiet. I let them believe the story they'd written. The clock on my phone crept past midnight. Christmas Day had officially begun. Somewhere downstairs, the tree lights blinked on and off, tirelessly cheerful. I checked my messages once more. No new alerts. Everything was still in place. Good. I finished packing just before dawn. My suitcase sat neatly by the door, unremarkable. Anyone passing by would assume I was preparing to leave temporarily, to cool off, to reflect. They wouldn't realize that this wasn't a break. It was an exit. I sat on my bed with my back against the wall and finally let myself breathe. The fear I'd expected never arrived. Instead, there was a strange calm, the kind that comes when you stop fighting reality and start working with it. They thought, all right, meant submission. They thought it meant I had accepted their terms. What it actually meant was that I had stopped asking for permission. As the first light of morning crept through the window, I stood and took one last look around the room that had held so many versions of me. The quiet one. The accommodating one. The one who believed patience would eventually be rewarded. I wasn't her anymore. By the time the house woke up, everything that mattered would already be in motion, and they wouldn't realize it until it was far too late. I woke before sunrise, the house wrapped in that fragile stillness that exists only when everyone believes the day will unfold the way they expect it to. The Christmas tree lights were still on downstairs, glowing softly through the banister rails. The smell of pine and cinnamon lingered in the air, almost convincing. For a moment, if I hadn't known better, I could have believed nothing had changed. My suitcase stood by my bedroom door, zipped and upright. Seeing it there grounded me. This wasn't a thought experiment anymore. This was happening. I showered quickly and dressed in neutral clothes, nothing that would draw attention. I wanted to look calm, ordinary, predictable. Panic would have raised questions. Calm would lower defenses. Before leaving my room, I checked my phone. There it was, a confirmation email that had been scheduled to arrive at dawn. Polite, professional, brief. It didn't congratulate me or reassure me. It simply acknowledged receipt and confirmed that my request had been processed. Processed. I exhaled slowly. The plan was no longer hypothetical. It existed outside my head now, recorded in someone else's system beyond my parents' reach. When I stepped into the hallway, the house was beginning to wake. I could hear my mother moving in the kitchen cabinet, doors opening and closing. My father's footsteps followed, heavier, more deliberate. Morning routines resumed as if nothing significant had happened the night before. I walked downstairs with my suitcase, careful not to rush. My mother looked up first. Her eyes flicked to the bag and then back to my face. She smiled, relieved. "You're up early," she said. "Couldn't sleep," I replied. She nodded, satisfied. In her mind, this was guilt, reflection, preparation. My father glanced over his coffee mug. "We'll talk later," he said again, repeating the phrase like a promise. "Sure," I said. My sister appeared in the doorway, hair pulled back, phone already in her hand. When she saw the suitcase, she stopped short. "You're leaving?" she asked. "Just for a bit," I said lightly. Her eyes narrowed just slightly. She looked past me toward the stairs as if checking whether there were more bags. When she didn't see any, her shoulders loosened a fraction. "Good," she said. "Space is probably healthy." I smiled politely and turned away before she could read anything else on my face. As my parents fussed over breakfast plans, I set my suitcase by the front door. The sound it made against the floor was small but final. No one commented on it. That was the first visible proof of departure, and they missed it completely. I poured myself coffee and sat at the table, my phone resting face down beside my cup. My heart wasn't racing. That surprised me. I felt like someone watching a play they'd already rehearsed. At exactly 8:15, my phone vibrated once. Then again. I didn't pick it up right away. Across the table, my sister stiffened. Her gaze snapped to her own phone. The color drained from her face as she read whatever was on the screen. She stood abruptly. "I need to take this," she muttered, already moving down the hallway. My mother frowned. "On Christmas morning?" "It's important," my sister said, her voice tight. The door to the den closed behind her. My father shook his head. "She's been under a lot of stress," he said, more to himself than to me. I took a slow sip of coffee. Stress was an understatement. A minute later, my phone vibrated again. A second confirmation. Different sender. Same neutral tone. Everything was unfolding exactly as planned. I didn't look at the screen. I didn't need to. Knowing was enough. My sister's voice drifted down the hall, hushed but urgent. I couldn't make out the words, only the cadence. Questions. Denials. Then silence. When she returned, her composure was gone. She avoided my eyes entirely and went straight to my mother, sitting close enough that their shoulders touched. My mother instinctively wrapped an arm around her. "It's nothing," my sister said quickly, as if answering a question no one had asked. "Just work stuff." My father nodded, satisfied with the explanation. He turned back to the newspaper. I watched the scene unfold with a strange sense of detachment. They were all playing their roles perfectly, unaware that the script had already changed. At 8:30, I stood and picked up my suitcase. "I'm heading out," I said. My mother looked startled. "Now I have somewhere to be." She hesitated, glancing at my father. He shrugged. "We'll talk when you get back." I didn't correct him. My sister finally looked at me then. Really looked. Her eyes were wide, searching my face for something she couldn't name. "You're coming back, right?" she asked. I tilted my head. "We'll see." That was when fear replaced uncertainty. I stepped outside into the cold morning air, the door closing softly behind me. The house remained quiet, insulated from the shift that had already begun. I didn't go far, just down the street where I could sit in my car and breathe. From there, I checked my phone properly for the first time. Messages, emails, notifications stacking up in neat lines. Everything I had set in motion overnight was now active. Nothing could be undone. I leaned my head back against the seat and closed my eyes for a moment. This was the point of no return. I felt it clearly. Whatever happened next would happen without my parents' permission, without my sister's approval. I wasn't running. I was repositioning. When I finally drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. My sister stood at the front window, phone pressed to her ear, watching my car disappear down the street. The look on her face wasn't anger. It was panic. That was the moment she realized I hadn't lost anything at all. I had already left. By the time I returned to the house later that afternoon, the air felt different, like something had cracked, and everyone was pretending not to hear it. My suitcase was still by the door where I'd left it. No one had moved it. That alone told me how unsettled things were. In my family, order was restored quickly and visibly. Shoes aligned, cushions fluffed, evidence erased. The fact that my bag remained untouched meant no one knew what to do with it yet. I stepped inside quietly. Voices drifted from the kitchen, low and tense. My parents were talking, not arguing, but not relaxed either. When they noticed me, the conversation stopped mid-sentence. "You're back," my mother said too quickly. "Just grabbing something," I replied. My sister was sitting at the table, phone in her hands, knuckles white. She looked up as I walked in, and for the first time since Christmas Eve, she didn't try to hide her reaction. Fear flashed across her face before she masked it with a tight smile. "You okay?" I asked lightly. She swallowed. "Fine." It was the wrong answer. Too sharp. Too rehearsed. She stood and followed me into the hallway, lowering her voice the moment we were out of earshot. "We need to talk," she said. I kept walking. "Do we—" "Yes," she snapped, then caught herself. "Please." That word didn't come naturally to her. We stopped outside my room. She glanced toward our parents' door, then back at me. "Did you tell anyone anything?" she asked. I raised an eyebrow. "Tell them what?" Her jaw clenched. "You know what I mean." I considered lying. It would have been easy. But something told me the truth, or a version of it would do more damage. "I handled my situation," I said. "That's all." Her eyes searched my face, desperate for confirmation, for denial, for something she could work with. "You didn't send anything," she said. "Right?" I shrugged. "Why would you think that?" The color drained from her face. She opened her mouth, then closed it again, clearly recalculating. The confidence she'd worn for days was gone, replaced by a frantic edge. "You don't understand what you're doing," she said finally. "You could mess things up." "For who?" I asked. "For all of us," she said quickly. "For the family." There it was, the word she always reached for when she needed obedience. I stepped closer, lowering my voice. "Funny," I said. "That concern never came up when my education was on the line." Her expression hardened. That was different. "Was it?" She looked away. "You should have just apologized." I smiled, slow and deliberate. "And let you finish whatever you started." She snapped her head back to me. "I didn't start anything." "Then why are you panicking?" I asked calmly. She didn't answer. We stood there in silence for a moment, the tension thick enough to taste. Finally, she spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. "You didn't talk to anyone official, did you?" That question told me everything. I didn't answer her. I didn't need to. The uncertainty was punishment enough. Her phone buzzed in her hand. She flinched like she'd been shocked and glanced at the screen. Whatever she saw made her grip the phone tighter. "I have to go," she muttered, already backing away. "Of course you do," I said. She retreated down the hall, shoulders stiff, leaving me alone with the quiet certainty that the balance had shifted. When I went back into the kitchen, my parents were pretending to be normal. My father was reading something on his phone, brow furrowed. My mother hovered near the counter, rearranging items that didn't need rearranging. "We need to talk later," my father said, not looking up. "We keep saying that," I replied. He glanced at me sharply, then softened his tone. "There's been some confusion today." Confusion. The word people use when control starts slipping. My mother stepped in quickly. "Your sister's just stressed. It's been a lot." "For her," I said. She frowned. "Don't start." I didn't. I let the silence do the work instead. My phone vibrated in my pocket. I didn't check it, but I saw my sister react from across the room, her head snapping up, her eyes darting to me. The panic was no longer subtle. Later that evening, the house descended into a strange limbo. Calls came in and were taken in private rooms. Doors closed. Voices dropped. My parents whispered more than they spoke. My sister barely left her room. No one asked me to apologize again. That told me more than any argument could have. I sat in the living room, flipping through a book without reading it, observing the way my family moved around me now. Carefully, cautiously, like I was something volatile. I wasn't angry. I felt oddly calm. This wasn't revenge. It was consequence. Around dinner time, my father finally sat across from me, his phone face down on the table. "There's some misinformation circulating," he said. I looked up. "About what?" He hesitated. "About you. About your plans." "My plans," I echoed. "Yes," he said slowly. "People are asking questions." I leaned back in my chair. People usually do when things are handled without consent. His jaw tightened. My mother shot him a warning look, but it was too late. "What exactly do you know?" he asked. I met his gaze steadily. enough to make my own decisions. That was when he realized the problem wasn't what I'd said. It was that I no longer needed him to decide for me. From down the hall, my sister's door creaked open. She stood there, eyes rimmed red, watching us like she was waiting for a verdict. I didn't look at her. I didn't need to. She had spent her entire life being protected by noise, by outrage, by tears that redirected blame. She had no idea how to survive once those shields failed. As the evening dragged on and the house remained suspended in uneasy quiet, one truth became impossible to ignore. They were no longer managing me. They were reacting to me. And for the first time, the golden girl was the one afraid of what came next. The confrontation didn't explode the way I'd imagined. It crept in quietly, wrapped in forced calm and careful language, which somehow made it worse. My parents called me into the dining room that evening, the same room where every major family decision had always been announced as if it were already settled. The table was cleared, untouched by dinner. My sister sat to one side, shoulders rigid, eyes fixed on the grain of the wood. "We need to talk," my father said. I sat down without hesitation. I didn't cross my arms. I didn't brace myself. I simply waited. My mother spoke first, her voice soft, rehearsed. "We're concerned about what's been happening today." Concerned how I asked. She exchanged a glance with my father. "There's been confusion. Calls. Questions we weren't expecting." My father leaned forward, hands clasped. "This didn't need to escalate," he said. "If you had just apologized, none of this would be happening." There it was, the familiar rewrite, cause and effect reversed until responsibility landed squarely back on me. I didn't escalate anything, I said calmly. I responded. My sister let out a sharp breath. "You embarrassed me," she said, suddenly looking up at last. "You could have handled it privately." I met her gaze. "So could you." "That's not the point," my father snapped. I looked at him. Then what is silence stretched across the table? My parents weren't used to being questioned like this. They were used to deciding, explaining, and being obeyed. My mother tried again, switching tactics. "We were trying to protect the family," she said. "You forced us into a corner." "No," I replied. "You chose a corner because it was convenient." My father's jaw tightened. "We suspended your schooling because your behavior left us no choice." "That's not true," I said evenly. "You did it because you'd already prepared for it." The words landed heavier than I expected. My mother froze. My sister's head snapped toward me. "What does that mean?" my father demanded. "It means," I said, choosing each word carefully, "that decisions about my education were discussed before Christmas Eve. Without me." My sister shot to her feet. "That's not fair," she said quickly. "You're twisting things." "Am I?" I asked. My father stood as well, anger flaring. "You don't know what you're talking about." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue details. I simply said, "I know enough." That was when the outside world forced its way in. My father's phone buzzed on the table. He ignored it. Then it buzzed again. And again. My sister's phone followed. She stared at the screen, face draining of color, before looking up at our parents in panic. "You need to answer that." My mother's phone chimed next, the sound sharp in the quiet room. My father finally grabbed his scowling. As he read, his expression shifted from irritation to confusion, then something close to fear. "What is it?" my mother asked. He didn't answer right away. "They want clarification," he said slowly. Who she pressed. "An office," he said. "About a request." My sister moved closer to the table, voice trembling. "What request?" He looked at her sharply. "What did you tell her?" "I didn't tell her anything," my sister said. "She's making this up." I leaned back in my chair. I didn't make anything up. I just stopped staying quiet. My mother looked at me, then really looked at me like she was seeing a stranger. "What did you do?" she asked. I finalized my plans, I said. Independently. You can't just do that, my father said. I already did. My sister let out a small broken sound. You sent something, didn't you? She said. You talked to someone. I didn't answer her. I didn't need to. My father's phone buzzed again. He stood there staring at it, the authority he usually carried slipping away with each second. This could have serious consequences, he said finally. For whom, I asked. For all of us, he snapped. That's what you said when you threatened my education, I replied. Funny how it matters now. My mother sank into her chair. We were just trying to manage things, she said weakly. You were trying to control them, I corrected. There's a difference. My sister's composure shattered then. You don't understand, she said, her voice rising. If this goes any further than cutting me off, I asked. Further than deciding my future without my consent? She stopped. Her mouth opened, then closed again. No defense came. My father turned to me, his tone changing, softening in a way that felt unfamiliar. Let's slow this down, he said. We can fix this. There's nothing to fix, I replied. Only things to face. The room fell silent again, thick and heavy. The narrative they'd relied on for years was slipping through their fingers, and there was no script for what came next. Finally, my father spoke. You should have trusted us. I met his gaze. I did. That's why this hurts. My sister backed away from the table, shaking her head. You're ruining everything, she whispered. No, I said quietly. I'm just no longer carrying it for you. Another phone buzz broke the silence. This time, my mother answered hers, her voice small as she spoke. When she hung up, she looked at my father, eyes wide. They're asking questions, she said. Real ones. My father closed his eyes for a moment, as if trying to will the situation back into something manageable. It wasn't. For the first time in my life, they weren't deciding my future. They were scrambling to keep up with it. And as I sat there calm and steady while the room spun around me, I understood something with absolute certainty. This wasn't the moment my family broke apart. It was the moment they realized they never had control over me at all. The house felt hollow after that, like all the sound had been drained out of it, and no one knew how to put it back. No one followed me when I left the dining room. No one slammed a door or called my name. I went upstairs and sat on the edge of my bed, listening to the muffled rhythm of my parents moving around below, slower now, unsure. The confrontation hadn't ended with shouting or ultimatums. It had ended with something far more unsettling for them: uncertainty. For the first time in my life, the family hierarchy was broken. My parents didn't know what to say to me. My sister didn't know how to position herself. The roles we'd all memorized had stopped working. I didn't feel victorious. I'd expected something sharper, maybe relief edged with anger. Instead, what settled over me was a quiet heaviness. Grief, but not for what I was losing. Grief for what I'd finally accepted I never really had. I wandered into my room and looked around, noticing how different it felt now that I wasn't waiting for approval anymore. The walls didn't feel like they were closing in. They felt temporary, neutral, like a place I'd already outgrown. Downstairs voices murmured again, but they weren't talking about me. Not directly. I could hear my parents discussing logistics, next steps, who might be calling tomorrow. Their concern had shifted. It wasn't about family unity anymore. It was about exposure. That told me everything. My sister didn't come near me for the rest of the night. I heard her door open and close. I heard her pacing. Once I heard her crying, the sound sharp and raw, not performative. That was new. For the first time, there was no one rushing in to soothe her, no one redirecting blame away from her discomfort. I felt a flicker of sadness for her then, not because she was innocent, but because she was unprepared. She had been raised to believe protection was permanent, that someone would always intervene before consequences landed. That belief had failed her. My phone buzzed quietly on my nightstand. I picked it up expecting another alert, another update. Instead, it was something steadier. Confirmation. Logistics finalized. Next steps outlined. The future I'd been building quietly without permission was now solid enough to stand on its own. I lay back on the bed and stared at the ceiling, letting that sink in. I wasn't suspended in uncertainty anymore. I was moving forward whether my family approved or not. That realization hurt more than I thought it would. For years I'd measured myself by their reactions. Their praise, their disappointment, their silence. I had shaped myself to fit the space they allowed me, hoping that one day it would expand. It never had. Now stripped of that framework, I had to answer a question I'd been avoiding my entire life. Who was I without their approval? The answer didn't come all at once. It arrived in pieces. In the calm I felt instead of panic. In the fact that I wasn't tempted to run downstairs and defend myself. In the way my decisions felt lighter when they weren't filtered through fear of displeasing someone else. I was someone who could choose distance without cruelty. Someone who could tell the truth without shouting. Someone who no longer needed to be believed by people who refused to listen. Later that night, my mother knocked on my door. I opened it to find her standing there with her arms folded, not defensively, but like she didn't know what to do with them. She looked older somehow. Smaller. "We're going to talk more tomorrow," she said. "Okay," I replied. She hesitated. Things didn't need to go this far. I met her eyes. They were already there. She swallowed, nodding slightly, then walked away without arguing. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't accountability. But it was the first time she hadn't dismissed me outright. That mattered. Just not enough to change my course. I finished packing what little I had left that night. Not because I was rushing, but because I didn't want to linger. Lingering had always been how I lost momentum. When I zipped my bag, the sound felt definitive. The next morning, the house moved around me cautiously. My parents avoided direct conversation. My sister stayed in her room. No one asked me to apologize again. No one threatened my education. They knew better now. As I carried my bag down the stairs, my father looked up from the kitchen table. For a moment, it seemed like he might say something meaningful, something real. Instead, he said, "You didn't have to do it this way." I paused at the door. Neither did you. Outside, the air was cold and clear, the kind that makes your lungs ache in a good way. I stood there for a moment, breathing, feeling the weight of the house lift from my shoulders. I wasn't angry anymore. Anger had burned itself out, leaving behind something quieter and more durable. Self-respect. I drove away without looking back, not because I didn't care, but because I finally understood that caring didn't require staying. Later that day, alone in a space that was mine, I sat with the silence and let it settle. There was loss in it. There always would be. But there was also room, space to build something that wasn't shaped by favoritism or fear. I hadn't destroyed my family. I had stepped out of a system that required me to disappear for it to function. Whatever came next would be different. Not easier, not painless, but honest. And for the first time in my life, that felt like enough. I woke up in a room that didn't belong to my parents, and for the first time in weeks, my chest felt light. The place was small and quiet. Nothing special to look at, but it was mine. No voices through the walls, no expectations hanging in the air, no unspoken rules about what I owed anyone in exchange for staying. I stood by the window with a cup of coffee and watched the morning traffic move past like a world that had already accepted I was part of it. That was the strange thing. Life didn't pause when I left. It didn't collapse. It kept moving steady and indifferent, and somehow that made everything feel easier. I settled into a routine quickly. Early mornings, long days, evenings spent reading or walking with no destination in mind. There was no drama here, no audience, just the quiet satisfaction of making decisions and living with them. I thought I would feel loss more sharply. I expected grief to ambush me when I least expected it. And sometimes it did in small ways. A song on the radio, a holiday commercial, a family laughing in a restaurant booth. But the grief wasn't what I feared most. What surprised me was the relief. I hadn't realized how much energy I'd spent managing myself around my family, measuring my words, anticipating reactions, editing my truth to keep the peace. Without that constant vigilance, my thoughts felt clearer. My body felt calmer. I slept better. When I thought about my parents, it was with a strange mix of sadness and clarity. They reached out once briefly. Not to apologize, not to take responsibility, but to ask when I would be ready to talk things through properly. I didn't respond, not out of spite, out of understanding. There was nothing left to explain. They weren't confused about what happened. They were uncomfortable with the consequences. My sister didn't contact me at all. I heard about her indirectly through family friends and vague updates that filtered their way back to me. She was struggling. Not because she'd lost something tangible, but because she'd lost certainty. The world was no longer rearranging itself to protect her. For the first time, she had to sit with outcomes she couldn't cry her way out of. I didn't feel satisfaction in that, just distance. The idea that I had lost my family was something people tried to hand me gently, like bad news they didn't want to hurt me with. But that framing never felt right. I hadn't lost them in a single dramatic moment. I'd been losing pieces of myself for years trying to keep them. What I lost when I left was the illusion that loyalty meant silence. What I gained was the ability to breathe without permission. I thought often about the word that had started everything. All right. It was such a small phrase. 2 ordinary words. To them it sounded like surrender. To me it became a line in the sand. Not spoken aloud, but drawn quietly, deliberately. All right meant I was done arguing inside a system that never intended to hear me. All right meant I was choosing myself without making a speech about it. All right meant I was stepping away from a version of family that only worked if one person stayed small. As time passed, the fear I'd carried for so long faded. The fear of being alone, the fear of being wrong, the fear that leaving would prove everything they'd ever said about me. None of that came true. I built a life that felt honest, not perfect, not easy, but real. I made friends who asked questions and listened to the answers. I worked hard without worrying who might resent my success. I learned to trust my instincts again. And slowly, almost without noticing, I stopped replaying the past. That's how I knew I had healed more than I thought. Looking back now, I understand something I couldn't see then. The real revenge wasn't exposure or confrontation. It wasn't winning an argument or forcing an apology. It was opting out of a dynamic that thrived on imbalance. It was taking my power back quietly and refusing to give it away again. If you're listening to this and something in it feels uncomfortably familiar, I want you to know this. Being asked to apologize just to keep the peace is not the same as being wrong. Being told you're difficult because you speak the truth is not a flaw. And choosing yourself does not make you disloyal or cruel. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is say very little and walk away with your dignity intact. If you've ever been the overlooked one, the convenient one, the one expected to shrink so someone else could shine, I'd love to hear your story. You're not alone, even when it feels that way. Leave a comment and tell me what resonated with you or where you're listening from. I read them and they matter more than you think. And if stories like this help you feel seen or remind you of your own strength, stay with me. Subscribe to the channel and come back for more real stories about family betrayal, quiet revenge, and finding your way back to yourself. Sometimes the most powerful transformation begins with a single word spoken calmly at the right moment. All right,